Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. Tonight we're learning Maseches Yoma, Daf Kaf Daled. We are about 10 lines down or so on Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. We're starting at the word Ba'e. And we're going to be learning about Trumas Hadeshen in two different ways tonight. Number one is when we do Trumas Hadeshen. Like all other mitzvos that we have in the Torah, there's typically a shiur. What is the shiur of Achila to be chayav on Yom Kippur? What is the shiur of carrying on Shabbos with which one would be chayav? What is the shiur of matzah that you have to eat in order to be yotzei the mitzvah? So here as well opens the Gemara 10 lines down. Chaf Daled Amud Aleph Ba'e Reb Avin Trumas Hadeshen Bekama. How much Trumas Hadeshen? How much ash must be removed when one does the mitzvah of Trumas Hadeshen? Do we say mitrumas meiser yalfinan? Do we learn from meiser because that has the language of harama, and that's 1 to 10 ratio. Meiser me'eser 1 of 10, or do we say mitrumas midyan yalfinan, which Rashi highlights as 1/500, the much smaller, that's not quite a handful, but it's a small amount. Says the Gemara, not this and not that. Answers the Gemara, Tashma, we have a brisa. Tani Reb Chia, Ne'emar kan veharim, ve'ne'emar lohalan vehirim. We have in two different psukim a reference to the word vehirim, alohalan bekumtzo, afkan bekumtzo. Here, the mitzvah of Trumas Hadeshen is done bekmitza. At a minimum, one is obligated to take a kmitza's worth of ash, which is again measured in the same way that one would measure as they would flour for a korban, where they take a handful of it, and then they open their pinky and their thumb, and whatever remains between the palm and their 3 middle fingers, that's considered the minimum shiur. Of course, I'm sure they took much more than that. It was probably done with a shovel of some kind, with a klishores. Nevertheless, we ignore the option of 1/10 and 1/500, and we look at it in a very small shiur of just a kmitza. This brings us to a huge machlokes in the Amoraim, halfway down on Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. What would happen if a non-Kohen were to do the Trumas Hadeshen? This is subject to a machlokes in the Amoraim. Says the Gemara as follows. Amar Rav, Arba Avodos. There are 4 types of avoda, 4 services that happen in the Beis Hamikdash that if a zar did, chayav alehen misa, yidi chayav misa. What are they, and what is not present? Here's what they are: zrika, v'haktara, v'nisuch hamayim, v'nisuch hayayin. Zrika tzadam, v'haktara by the ktoras, the nisuch hamayim, which was done by the time of Sukkot, and nisuch yayin, to do wine libations. Those 4 things, if a non-Kohen were to do them, he would be chayav misa. That's the shita of Rav. The blaring omission is Trumas Hadeshen. We don't see that the Trumas Hadeshen is mentioned here. However, Levi Amar Af Trumas Hadeshen. Levi agrees to the first 4. He agrees to the first 4 that Rav said. Af is a language of even. Yes to that, but even this, I'm going to add a 5th one, which is Trumas Hadeshen. V'chein tani le b'masni say Af Trumas Hadeshen. So did Levi say, b'masni say. The Yud Hey ending at that word means in his Mishnah. This is a reference to the Tosefta, which was written by Levi and Bar Kapara. It doesn't say b'masnitza in a Mishnah. It says b'masnisei in his Mishnah, a reference to what he put together in the early times of the Amoraim, which was the Tosefta. This is our machlokas, Rav and Levi. According to Rav, if a non-Kohen were to do the avod of the Trumas Hadeshen, he is not chayav misa. However, Levi says he is. Let's dig in. My time of the Rav. Why does Rav say that Trumas Hadeshen is excluded from the chiyuv misa of a zar? So says the Gemara as follows. Dichsid, because the pasuk writes a long pasuk, Be'atov v'necha yitzchot tishmur es kunaschem l'chol davar mizbeach u'lemibeis ba'paroches va'avadetem avodas matana. Those are going to be the words that we need for now. Avodas matana. When you do avodas matana, then the zara karev yumas, and the zara, the non-Kohen who does the hakrava, is going to die. Says the Gemara, avodas matana. Only listen to the language. It's a beautiful pshat in the pasuk. Avodas matana. That's when you're doing an action of giving. However, what's the diuk? V'lo avodas siluk. However, when you're removing something, as is the avod of the Trumas Hadeshen, so therefore that's not going to be part of the pasuk of v'hazara karev yumas. So therefore, Rav looks in the Torah, and somebody says to him, "Is Trumas Hadeshen a chiyuv misa for a zar?" And he says, "No, it's not. It's not at all, because the pasuk says it's only avodas matana, only when you're doing the giving of an avoda, but not when you're doing a siluk, such as the Trumas Hadeshen." And the drasha continues within Rav's understanding. Va'avadatem. What does the pasuk mean when it says va'avadatem? Avodatam v'lo avoda sheish acharei avoda. That when we're talking about an avoda in the Beis Hamikdash upon which you're going to be chayiv, it also has to be the makeh b'patish of the avoda. If it's 8 steps, then you have to be able to do the last of them in order to be chayiv. But here, the Trumas Hadeshen is the first of many, and therefore you're not going to be chayiv for those 2 reasons. We're about 8 lines from the bottom of the page on Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. We've learned the shita of Rav, who says that Trumas Hadeshen is excluded from the zar being chayiv misa. A zar is not chayiv misa if he does Trumas Hadeshen, and we proved it from the pasuk. The Levi, well, what does Levi do with this? So it says the Gemara of Levi, Rabbi Rachmana l'chol dvar hamizbeach. Levi is of the opinion that no, if you look back in the pasuk a few lines above us says as follows: Ve'atov anecha itecha tishmeru es kunaschem l'chol dvar hamizbeach. So he says that the pasuk is l'chol dvar hamizbeach. So we include, it's a language of inclusion. L'chol, it's for everything. So what does it mean, l'chol dvar hamizbeach? So that's what Levi says. It means everything, even the Trumas Hadeshen, even an avoda of siluk, of removing, and therefore Levi is of the opinion against Rav that when a non-Kohen does the Trumas Hadeshen, he's going to be chayiv misa. The Rav, according to Rav, what do you do with those words of l'chol dvar hamizbeach? Levi looked at the words l'chol dvar hamizbeach, 7-8 lines from the bottom of Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. Levi looks at those words and he says l'chol dvar hamizbeach. It's so inclusive. We're even going to say that there's an isur d'oraisa of not an isur d'oraisa, you're chayiv misa. It's even worse than an isur d'oraisa, that you're chayiv misa for Trumas Hadeshen. And what does Rav do with those words? Hahu, no. When the pasuk says l'chol dvar hamizbeach, what does Rav do with those words? Hahu, that comes to teach me la'asuye sheva hazos shebifnim v'sheva mitzora. The 7 hazos, 7 sprinklings that took place inside the Kodesh HaKodashim, and Sheva Mitzorah, and the sprinklings of the Mitzorah. But that pasuk is not referencing the avod of the Trumas Hadeshen. It's a specific reference. Rashi speaks this out a little bit, that that's not what the pasuk is talking about. Well, if that's true, Levi, according to Levi, where do you learn out the hazos from? If Rav is going to use the pasuk of the l'chol dvar hamizbeach to teach me the Sheva hazos shebifnim and the Mitzorah, that the sprinklings have to be done inside the Kodesh and for a Mitzorah. But if Rav's using the pasuk to teach that, but Levi's using that pasuk for something else, where does Levi learn that out from? The Levi, 5 lines from the bottom, nafkalei, midavar v'chol davar. Because we have an extra word, it could have just said midavar. Why did it say v'chol davar? So the word v'chol, he's parsing out his drasha. When it says the chol davar, when it says the word v'chol davar, he knows this is an extra word. Rav, what do you do with this drasha? Rav, the capstone of this conversation, very simple. Davar v'chol davar lo darish. This is amazing. What does that mean? It means that there are some guidelines, that there are some rules, there are some stipulations of when we make drashos. And there's a machlokes fundamentally about whether or not we could look at the word v'chol on its own and say, is it worthy of a drasha? So Levi was of the opinion that it's worthy of a drasha, and Rav is of the opinion that it's not. So if we were to stop here, we would see a clear machlokes between Rav and Levi, each of them with psukim to boot. And Rav would be of the opinion that Trumas Hadeshen would not be chayiv if a zar were to do it, a non-Kohen would do it. And Levi is of the opinion that even Trumas Hadeshen, if a zar did it, he'd be chayiv misa. Asks the Gemara 4 lines from the bottom, ve'ema, maybe we could argue as follows. It says, l'chol davar hamizbeach, that's a very general comment, that's a klal. Avodas matana, when it specifies down to the fact that it's an avodas matana, that the avoda is a matana, it's an act of giving, that's a prat. So it says the Gemara, klalu prat. Klalu prat, ein bechlal ela mashe beprat. This is not one of the hermeneutical principles that we're familiar with. It's a deviation on the theme. But nevertheless, this is a shita, a question of the Gemara, which is that we have a klalu prat. So why didn't we analyze the pasuk this way to say that it's a klalu prat? What would have been the conclusion had we done that? Avodas matana in, avodas siluk lo, that because the klal and the prat have to have a common denominator, so therefore we would have said that it has to be avodas matana, that the prat has to be true of all things, and therefore how could you ever say that siluk is going to be chayev akashia on Levi? Because Levi was of the opinion that if a non-Kohen did the avoda of Trumas Hadeshen, he'd be chayev. But if we look at it from the lens of klalu prat, like it seems very clearly that the pasuk is structured that way, then Levi has to be wrong. Answers the Gemara, Amar Kra, turning to the top of Chaf Daled Amud Beis. No, because the pasuk says it is only true. When do we say these rules? The klalu prat that only applies in one place, by the paroches in the Kodesh. El mi beis la paroches u da'avodas matana. The language of the Prat of Avodas Matana and the Klalu Prat is specific to one location, which is in the Kodesh by the Paroches. Velo Avodas Siluk. However, Habachutz, if you're outside of the Kodesh and seemingly outside of the Heichal, we'll dig into that in a minute. Afilu Avodas Siluk, that there would be a Chiyuv Misa. So how does Levi get out of this? The pasuk seems to take Klalu Prat. So Levi's brilliant. He looks at the pasuk. He's like, "What are you talking about?" The pasuk, when it says Avodas Matana, is referring to the paroches, which is in the Kodesh HaKodashim. But the Dishun Mizbeach, when you're doing the Haramas HaMizbeach, that's the Mizbeach that's outside the Heichal. It's apples and oranges. So you want to tell me that there's no Isser of Avodas, of the Zar in the Kodesh? Well, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We're not talking about that. So Levi's Shita could still withstand the question of the Gemara of the Pradu Klal, because the pasuk that he's referencing is talking about the paroches, which is by the Kodesh HaKodashim. And here we're not talking about that, so his Shita stands up. Third line of Chavdal Amud Bey says the Gemara, Yihachi, if what you're saying is true, that there's a distinction between the Kodesh and the Chutz, between the Paroches area and outside by the Mizbeach HaGadol, Yihachi va'avadatem nami al mibeis la paroches hu de'avoda tama v'lo avoda sheish acharei avoda habachutz afilu avoda sheish acharei avoda. This is a question against Rav. Rav was of the opinion that because there are activities to be done after the Trumas Hadeshen, therefore a Zar cannot be chayiv. A Zar can only be chayiv according to Rav. A Zar can only be chayiv according to Rav, if the act that you're doing is the final act. And this is not a final act because the Trumas Hadeshen has things to follow it. So says the Gemara, if the way that Levi looks at the pasuk is right, that the pasuk's only referencing what happens in the paroches, so then maybe Rav's rule only applies in by the paroches and not outside. But had it been outside Taka, maybe we would have said that one would have been chayiv, and that's a kasha on Rav, because Rav says that there's no chiyuv misa by the Trumas Hadeshen. So answers the Gemara, va'avadatem hadar ar beikra, with the language of the vav. Va'avadatem, it adds in this fact that it applies in both locations, and therefore the shita of Rav is maintained. Next little section, we're 8 lines down on Chavdal Amud Beis. Asks the Gemara, we've spoken about the area of the Kodesh. We've spoken about the area of the Chutz. In between the two is the Heichal, is the area of the Kodesh where we have the Mizbeach and where we have the Menorah. We have the Mizbeach HaZahav, we have the Menorah, we have the Shulchan. So it says the Gemara, hold on one second. You've talked about X and you've talked about Z, but you haven't talked about Y. Asks the Gemara, Boy Rava, Avodas Siluk Beheichal Mahu. We've been talking about taking Trumas Hadeshen from the Mizbeach HaGadol outside of the Holy of Holies and outside of the Holy. It's the big Mizbeach on the outside where the Tamid was brought and most of our Korbanos were brought. But what about the room where the Mizbeach HaZahav was? Not in the Kodesh HaKodashim, that we discussed. But what about in the room where there's a menorah and where there's a shulchan? Do we say lifnim midamin le, that it's similar to that which is inside? Namely, we would treat it the same as the paroches area. O lachutz midamin le, or do we compare the heichal to the outside by the mizbeach hagadol? So hadar pashta mi beis ula mi beis. So then the Gemara says a drasha that's very difficult to understand without rishonim. And a special thank you to Rashi. Take a look just to our left. It's not a classical dibur hamaskal, but I have a bolded word that says mi beis. I'm not sure that all of the gersos have that, but I see it here. So just follow along right with me. It's just to the left, one line down. Mi beis la paroches. It should have said mi beis la paroches. Uchsiv ula mi beis la paroches. Lasos heichal ke beis kodesh kodashim, to say that the heichal, the room in which we house the shulchan and the menorah, that is similar to the beis kodesh kodashim upater al avoda siluk. And Levi's reading of the pasuk is correct, that the avoda siluk doesn't apply to that particular room. So that's how the Gemara answers, that the room with the shulchan and with the mizbeach hazahav and with the menorah have the same din as the paroches. Says the Gemara, Elameata, if that's true that the heichal is similar to the kodesh hakodashim, then what happens in the following scenario? Zar, if you have a non-kohen, shesider es hashulchan lechayev. Maybe we should say that this is avodas matana, you're setting up the shulchan. Maybe we should say that you're chayiv in such a case for setting up the shulchan if you're a non-kohen. Says the Gemara, no, ika sidur bazichin. It wasn't the avodah tama. It wasn't the final step of the showbreads, of the shulchan. Why? Because we also had to sprinkle the frankincense. So it says the Gemara, fine. Sidur bazichin lechayev. This is going to be a very quick back and forth. Sidur bazichin lechayev. So what if the zar does that? Says the Gemara, no, ika siluk v'haktara. No, we're not done yet because later the end of the avoda is to remove it and to do an act of haktara as well. And that ends that story because we know that siluk is not what we're talking about. We're talking about avodas matana. 1/3 of the way down, almost 1/3 of the way down, Chav Dalet Amud Beis says Gemara, Zar Shesider Menorah L'chayev. What if a Zar goes and sets up the menorah in the Heichal? We said it's just like the Kodesh. The Zar should be chayev. Says the Gemara, Ika Nesinas Psila. No, that's not the end. Okay, if he pours in the oil, that's great, but he didn't put in the wicks yet. Fine. What if Nasan Psila Lechayev? Maybe we should say if he puts in the wicks, he's going to be held accountable. He'll be chayev misa. Says the Gemara, Ika Nesinas Shemen. No, in such a case, a person still needs to add the oil. Nasan shemen lechayv. What if he did that? Ika hadlaka. No, he still didn't finish that. He still can light, and the lighting is the avodah tama. That's the last act. Then the Gemara says, hadlaka hidlik lechayv. Great, stop. You're kicking the can down the road. Our point is, what if the Zar does the final act in any avodah? He lit the menorah. There is no act after lighting the menorah. Then the Gemara drops a bomb. Hadlaka lav avodahi. Wow, the hadlakas haner in the mikdash is not begeder avoda, which means that if a Zar, what?
Then the ashes are picking out the ashes of the menorah is the final step.
We don't even care about that. We've undermined the whole conversation because once you say that lighting candles is not going to be considered an avoda, then if a Zar does that activity, he didn't do an avoda. He just lit a bunch of candles. The avoda of the menorah is everything in the setup, but the hadlaka, says the Gemara, is not a zero. It's just not. It's not an avoda. So therefore, a Zar can do it technically. I should say it's not that he can. It's that he won't be chayiv misa.
So everything leading up is an avoda, but not the.
That's how the Gemara seems to frame it.
Since not lighting is the last step, then there's no.
Therefore, there's no chiyuv misa for the Zar because the avoda tama, the capstone to the activity was pariv. It was just whatever. Just he wasn't chayiv misa. It wasn't considered an avoda. And the Gemara pushes emphatically against this. Velo. How can you say that the hadlak of the menorah is not an avoda? Drasha. Wow, what's the drasha of this? We learned about the burning of wood chips. Kasher. It has to be with a kohen who's kasher, no ba'alei mum, and it has to be b'kli shares. What's implied? That when you light the wood chips, it's an avoda. Because we needed a kohen kasher and we needed to have a kli shares. Says the Gemara, okay, yeah, but does it say menorah? Hatzah, we're halfway down. Hatzasas alisa avodahi, the lighting of the wood chips is considered an avoda, but adlaka lav avodahi. Says the Gemara, elamiata, if what you're saying is true, that's not an avoda, then just setting up the wood should be the chiyuv. The fire is not the problem, setting up the wood. Says the Gemara, yeah, but ika sidur shnei gizreitim, we have a separate way of parsing out. Remember, we've learned this first. You do 5 pieces of the 5 things of the menorah, and then you do the 2 things. And here we're talking about the wood. Ika sidur shnei gizreitim. When you put down the last 2 blocks of wood, that should be the chiyuv. Sidur shnei gizreitim lechayev. Says the Gemara, that's really not the end of the process. Forget the fire. Ika sidur evarim. You have to put the limbs on, and he didn't do that. Says the Gemara, Ve'amar Avasim Rav Yochanan Zar shesider shnei gizreitim chayev. However, we have an explicit comment of Rabbi Yochanan who says that if there is a Zar who puts the shnei gizreitim, they are chayev. So how can you say they're not chayev? So says the Gemara, this leads us to a machlokes. V'ha pligi, mar savar avoda tamahi. According to one shita, the placement of the shnei gizreitim, the 2 blocks of wood, is the final act, and therefore a Zar would be chayev. Ma'ashe'en kenu mar savar lav avoda tamahi, and that the other shita holds not that way, and then the sidur shnei gizreitim would not be problematic. Going back to our initial machlokes, we're going to bring some text proofs to the shita of Rav and to Levi. Let's review. Rav was of the opinion that the Trumas Hadeshen was not a chiyuv misa for a Zar to do, and Levi says it is. Says the Gemara, 2/3 of the way down, Tanya kavase de Rav, Tanya kavase to Levi. Tanya kavase de Rav. What is the brisa that supports the shita of Rav? What are we looking for? We're looking for nothing. We're looking to see Trumas Hadeshen not being mentioned. Because we want, if we're trying to prove Rav's shita, Rav holds that if a Zar does the act of Trumas Hadeshen, that he's not chayiv misa. So let's see what Rav says here. The Brisa writes, Avodos shezar chayiv alei misa. What are the activities for which a Zar would be chayiv misa? The Gemara answers, Zrikat Hadam, Bein milifnim, Bein lifnai v'lifnim. Whether, no matter where you do the Zrikat Hadam, you're not going to be chayiv misa, at least for the Zrika. Vehamazeh bechat hasaof, the blood of a chat hasaof. Vehamimatzeh, one who squeezes the blood against the wall of the mizbech, which is something we learned about in a previous masechta. Vehamaktir ba'ol hasof, one who burns those birds. Vehamenatech shlosha lugin mayim, one who does the avoda of nisuch hamayim with the 3 log of water, v'shlosha lugin yain, and also to do nisuch hamayim. What's missing? Trumas Hadeshen. So Rav has a beautiful brisa. Rav started out the day today by telling us that Trumas Hadeshen, if a zar does it, he's not chayiv misa. What's his raya? A brisa that tells us a limited list, an exclusionary list. These 4 things are chayiv misa for a zar. What's missing? Trumas Hadeshen. Beautiful raya. What's the proof for Levi? Now we're looking for inclusion. We're looking to see if Trumas Hadeshen is mentioned explicitly. Tanya Kavase to Levi. What does the brisa say? Avodos shazar chayiv alein misa. What are the activities, the avodas and the Beis Hamikdash for which a non-Kohen who does them would be chayiv misa? Answers the Gemara, Hamerim es hadeshen. Number 1, we could stop learning right now on this one because what does the brisa say? Trumas hadeshen is chayiv misa for a zar. That's Levi through and through. So now each of our Amoraim have their roots in a brisa. Continues this brisa with the remainder of the list. The sheva hazot shebifnim v'sheva metzora, the 7 sprinkles that are done by the paroches and the sprinkling that's done for a metzora. The hamale al gabe hamizbech bein a davar kasher bein davar pasol. Anything you put on the mizbech, that's the machloket between Rav and Levi. And what the Gemara does not do, even though methodologically we would have thought it would have existed here, is to ask, could it be that there's a way to make these 2 brises fit together? The problem is that no, these brises are very explicit. These are the things that you're chayiv as a zar. Rav says 1, 2, 3, 4, and Levi says 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're different 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's very hard to say that there's anything other than 2 different authors for these brises, and therefore the machlokes that we see in Rav and Levi really has its roots in the Tanoim. There's a machlokes Tanoim. Do we say that if a non-Kohen does the avodah of Trumas Hadeshen, do we say that one is going to be chayiv misa, yes or no? Rav says no, and Levi says yes. One short little sugya to finish the night. Lama mifaisin. Why did we do the pius? Why did we do the lottery? Says the Gemara, have you been present at Daf Yomi for the last little while? We gave a whole host of reasons why. Remember the guy who got shoved off the ramp and broke his leg? Or the other guy who had his heart stabbed with a knife? We have a bunch of reasons. So I said to the Gemara, Lama mefaisin, Kidamran. Go look back to blood. What are we talking about? Just look in the Gemara. Everybody knows why we do the pious, because people were hurting each other. Says the Gemara, no, you misunderstood my question. Ella, lama mefaisin v'chozer nu mefaisin. If you look back in our Mishnah, which was it yesterday that we learned the new Mishnah? Wherever we learned our Mishnah, a couple of blot ago. So the Brisa there wrote here, it's at the beginning of the parak on Chav Beis Amud Aleph. And Rash, the last line of the Mishnah on Chav Beis Amud Aleph reads as follows. Arba paisos hein sham, hayusham, v'zeh pais harishon. This was the first one. So what was basically happening here was that we only had 1 pais at a time. What the Gemara wants to know is if there are 4 lotteries, have all the Kohanim huddle around, roll the wheel, do the lotteries, and get it over with everything at once. Why do we parse out? We're going to do number 1 now. We're going to do number 2 in a few hours. We're going to do lottery number 3 a little bit later, and lottery number 4 still later. Why do we separate out all the lotteries? That's the Gemara's question. We know why we do Mafias here, why we did the lottery by the Trumas Hadeshen, because people were hurting each other. So that's the Gemara's question. Why do we break out the 4 different lotteries into 4 different times? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because it elevated the emotions of the room. Shne'emar, asher yachdav namtik sod, beveis Elokim nehalech beragesh. That this would create a lot more excitement, a lot more. This is like pedagogy 101. It's like when you're, when you're a classroom teacher. So when I was in Hillel Torah, I was a Rebbe there. They sent me to this training course called RBT, Research for Better Teaching. They gave us 100 tools to keep the room engaged. You got popsicle sticks with everybody's name on it. So you hold it up and you say, all right, I'm going to pick one out of here in 1 minute after I teach an idea, and then you're going to repeat the idea to me. What do all the kids do? They look in the book because they don't know if they're going to be picked. Everything changes in the room. So you pick out the stick. It says Ari on it. It says blood on it. You got to be ready now. You got to be ready. And then 5 minutes later, okay, we're going to do it. And you just keep the pedagogy. So the Gemara here is adding an emotional pedagogy, as it were. We needed to keep everyone really engaged and really excited. That is how the Gemara did it. We'll stop right here at B'mam Mefaisin at the bottom of Chav Daled and base tomorrow night, a blot and a half of Chav Hey and Chav Vav Amud Aleph, all the way to the top of Chav Vav Mebez at the Mishnah. That's where we're going to stop. Wishing you all a beautiful night.